When we look up at the night sky, the stars seem perfectly still. Yet in truth, they're whispering the story of time itself. In the silence between the universe's breaths lies a tale older than every civilization, deeper than every faith. The story of Earth, and of that fleeting moment when nothingness became life. Before the pyramids, before the oceans, before the first breath of air, this planet was nothing more than a sphere of fire drifting in darkness, waiting for a single spark to awaken the miracle. There were no witnesses to that moment, only rock, dust, and the faint echo of a beginning. Everything we call history, the empires, the wars, the great names, is just a thin layer of paint brushed over Earth's 4.5 billion-year-old skin. Every grain of sand, every stone, every gust of wind has seen worlds that no human ever knew, and quietly buried them in the deep layers of memory. In tonight's episode of Bedtime History, we'll journey back to the dawn of the planet, a time before time itself, when life was only a thought waiting to take shape. If one day you could travel back in time, back more than 4 billion years, the first thing you'd see wouldn't be a blue sky, but an endless ocean of fire. The air was thick like smoke, heavy with ash and sulfur. The ground was cracked, glowing red like the surface of the sun. There were no birds, no trees, no gentle wind, only the thunder's roar, the hiss of volcanoes, and the rising steam from oceans still being born. The young Earth was a vast forge where metal, stone, and water clashed and melted together. Meteor storms rained down ice from space, only to have it vaporize on impact. And yet, it was this chaos that laid the foundation for stability. Water began pooling in giant craters across the planet's crust, forming the first lakes, then merging into the world's earliest oceans. The sky wasn't blue. It was a thick, grey-black sea of clouds, no oxygen, no ozone, no sunlight piercing through. Lightning split the darkness again and again, lighting up the sky for brief, violent moments where chemical particles collided and fused. In those flashes of fire, the first reactions of life began. Scientists call this the Hadean Eon, from Hades meaning hell. And that's exactly what it was. Temperatures soared above 1,000 degrees Celsius. Rivers of lava flowed endlessly. The air was filled with methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. Every breath, if you could take one, would be poison. But in this inferno, something extraordinary began to stir. Somewhere deep in the hot, mineral-rich oceans, perhaps around volcanic vents on the seafloor, simple molecules started to bond. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, may have formed in that very chaos, and as they joined together, they created the first chains, capable of copying themselves, the ancestors of DNA. Life didn't begin through a miracle, but through time and the quiet patience of nature. The Earth then was a giant laboratory running billions of experiments at once. Most failed, breaking apart the moment they formed. But all it took was one structure that lasted a little longer, copied a little faster, to cross the thin line between lifeless and living. For the first time in the universe's history, a molecule could replicate itself. From that moment, life began a journey that would never end. Above, the skies were still dark and toxic. But in the oceans below, tiny bubbles of gas began to rise, breaking on the surface before fading away. Bubbles filled with methane, hydrogen sulfide, and the faintest breath of early life. Millions of years later, ancient microbes, archaea and bacteria, would release oxygen and transform the air forever. But for now, Earth was still a planet of sulfur and steam. If you could walk upon that land, every step would sink into hot ash. the sun would appear only as a pale glow behind thick clouds. The wind would burn with acid, and the raindrops that fell weren't made of pure water, but sulfuric acid. There was no shelter, no sound but the rumbling of volcanoes and the deep heartbeat of the planet. And yet, within all that fury, Earth was quietly learning to become gentle. Day by day, the crust began to cool. Rivers of lava hardened into mountain ranges, steam rose and condensed, falling as endless rains that lasted thousands of years. Each drop of rain soothed the planet's rage, singing it slowly into a softer sleep. Beneath the surface, the core of iron and nickel spun, generating a magnetic field strong enough to shield it from the solar wind. Even before life truly began, Earth was already building its defenses, as if it somehow knew the future was worth protecting. When the Earth finally began to cool, when the surface hardened from seas of lava into cracked stone, the skies were still far from calm. Each night was a storm of falling stars, streaks of fire cutting across the smoky heavens and fading in blazing trails along the horizon. But this wasn't just a spectacle, it was destiny. Inside those wandering rocks from deep space, wrapped in ice and cosmic dust, lay the first organic fragments of life itself. For hundreds of millions of years, the young planet endured a relentless bombardment so fierce that scientists call it the Late Heavy Bombardment, the Great Late Assault. Thousands of asteroids struck each day, melting newly formed oceans and carving countless scars into the surface. Yet through the devastation they brought gifts: water, carbon, and the molecules that carried the breath of the universe. When those frozen bodies shattered, the water spread across the planet, pooling in deep basins. The first oceans were born, vast, dense, and dark as ink. There, minerals from Earth's crust mingled with organic compounds from space, creating a rich, turbulent brew, the primordial soup, as scientists call it today. At the boundary between fire and water, lightning still lashed the seas, flashes of raw energy linking nitrogen and carbon, giving birth to amino acids, the building blocks of protein. From proteins came the first cell membranes, and within those shimmering droplets, molecules capable of replication began to form. No one witnessed the moment, but we know it happened because we are its descendants. Perhaps in a crack deep beneath the ocean floor, near a hydrothermal vent, those early molecular chains found shelter from the ultraviolet rage above. There, heat, minerals, and pressure created the perfect chemistry. One molecule copied itself, then two, then countless more. Life didn't need intention, it only needed opportunity, and the planet gave it that chance. The first organisms had no eyes, no mouths, no shapes we'd recognize. They were single cells drifting in the warm darkness of the sea, carrying within them the earliest code of heredity. From that moment, the ocean was no longer silent. Warm currents began to move, chemical reactions pulsed like a hidden heartbeat beneath the waves. Seen from space, Earth would have appeared as a dark, blue-black sphere wrapped in steam, lightning flashing, fading, flashing again, no sound, no witnesses. But within that thick, clouded world, matter was quietly arranging itself into the language of life. Maybe life didn't truly arrive from elsewhere. Maybe it simply awoke. The ingredients were already here, locked inside the stardust that formed the planet itself. When the right conditions aligned, those particles remembered how to be alive. In that sense, life is the ancient memory of the universe, stirring once more in the depths of the primordial sea. In that microscopic realm, proteins, membranes, and replication systems slowly took shape, a fragile but persistent web of reactions that would decide the planet's future. The air was still thick with methane and the sky remained dark and grey. Earth had given birth to life, but it wasn't yet ready to breathe alongside it. Hundreds of millions of years passed after the first oceans were born. The land was still barren, no grass, no leaves, no sound except the crash of waves and the wind brushing across naked stone. But beneath those murky waters, life was quietly spreading. Small, patient, endlessly dividing. The single-celled creatures, invisible to the human eye, were the planet's first engineers. They had no awareness, yet they achieved something that had never happened before. They began to transform Earth's atmosphere. This was the Archean era, around 3.5 billion years ago. In the warm shallows of the young seas, a remarkable kind of organism emerged, cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. Tiny enough that millions could fit inside a single drop of water, yet capable of something extraordinary: photosynthesis. By capturing sunlight, they split water into hydrogen and oxygen, using the energy to survive. For the first time in history, light was turned into life. Cyanobacteria gathered in mats along the muddy coasts, slowly forming layered, dome-shaped structures called stromatolites. Each layer was a record of life and death, a fossilized memory of time itself. Even today, these formations can still be found in places like Australia, South Africa, and Canada, silent witnesses from an age when Earth was still learning how to run its own systems, and yet these peaceful little creatures unknowingly became the first killers in the planet's history. The oxygen they released, a byproduct of photosynthesis, was poison to most of the ancient life that had evolved in a world without it. Back then, all living things depended on chemical reactions that thrived in an oxygen-free environment. As oxygen accumulated, it reacted violently with iron in the oceans, forming thick layers of rust-colored rock hundreds of meters deep. The great banded iron formations we still see today, proof that Earth was changing its very blood. Over countless ages, the sky began to shift in color. The thick haze of dust and gases slowly settled, and sunlight pierced through for the first time, casting a faint blue reflection across the water. Oxygen, once the destroyer of an old world, had become the foundation of a new one. After the skies cleared and the first sunlight touched the oceans, it seemed as though Earth had finally entered an age of calm. But nature has never allowed peace to last for long. Life, newly born and fragile, was about to face a trial so severe that it nearly silenced the planet forever. Around 2.3 billion years ago, after the great oxygen catastrophe caused by cyanobacteria, the concentration of methane, the planet's natural blanket, dropped sharply. Oxygen reacted with methane, turning it into carbon dioxide and water, weakening the greenhouse effect that had kept Earth warm. Back then, the sun shone about 1/3 dimmer than it does today, and the planet began to cool day by day. Ice spread outward from the poles. At first, it clung to the mountains, then crept across plains, down to the seas, until nearly the entire surface, even the equator, lay under a frozen shell. The planet became a gleaming white sphere, Snowball Earth. Scientists believe the oceans were sealed beneath sheets of ice hundreds of meters thick, with only a few warm pockets around volcanic vents deep below the surface. No sunlight, no rain, no rivers flowing. From space, the once blue world now drifted as a silent marble of ice through the darkness of the cosmos. Beneath the frozen crust, tiny microbes huddled around hydrothermal vents, rare oases of warmth in a frozen desert. These were the lonely sanctuaries of life. Never had Earth come so close to death. Many scientists call this period the choke point of life, when evolution nearly stopped. If temperatures had dropped just a few degrees more, the oceans might have frozen solid. and the story of life would have ended there. But somehow the planet held on to a faint breath of warmth, a flickering heartbeat that refused to stop. For millions of icy years, volcanoes never slept. Beneath the heavy lid of ice, carbon dioxide kept bubbling up from Earth's core but couldn't escape into the atmosphere. Over time, it built up to critical levels, reigniting the greenhouse effect. The planet began to warm again. The glaciers melted, slowly at first, drop by drop, then all at once. The thaw was anything but gentle. Trapped CO2 sent temperatures soaring, turning the atmosphere into a furnace. Water evaporated violently, lightning flashed across the skies, and global storms raged for centuries. Rivers of lava poured into the sea, releasing minerals that nourished what little life remained. And when the final rays of sunlight broke through the thick clouds, life, astonishingly, rose again, stronger than before. The survivors of that frozen age became the ancestors of all complex life that followed. Pushed to the edge of extinction, they learned to cooperate, to share energy, to merge, to live together in ways they never had before. From lonely single cells, they joined into bodies, the first organisms that knew how to work as one. After billions of years of trial and silence, after endless cycles of freezing and thawing, Earth seemed to restart itself. The oceans, once cold graves, had become warm cradles. The atmosphere was rich with oxygen, sunlight shimmered on clear blue waters, and deep below the waves, the seeds of life that had waited for millions of years suddenly awakened all at once. This was the Cambrian period, the time when life exploded like fireworks beneath the sea. For the first time, living things could take shape, move, and reproduce, a turning point not just for the planet, but for the very idea of life itself. Before the Cambrian, the world was filled only with simple beings, soft-bodied, single-celled, fragile as mist. And then, for reasons still mysterious, life suddenly became complex. In just a few dozen million years, keep a blink in the universe's timeline, nearly every major body plan appeared. Heads, eyes, legs, spines. Scientists call this moment the Cambrian explosion, the dawn of animal diversity. The Cambrian seas were strange and mesmerizing, filled with creatures that seemed to drift straight out of dreams. There was Anomalocaris, the weird shrimp, almost a meter long, with curved arms and a circular, saw-like mouth, Earth's first true predator. There was Opabinia, with 5 eyes and a long, hooked trunk, a surreal creature, as if painted by imagination itself. And crawling slowly across the seafloor were trilobites, leaving the first deliberate tracks. Signs of behavior, not just existence. But it wasn't only bodies that evolved, it was strategy. For the first time, there were hunters and prey. Creatures learned to wear armor, grow spines, burrow into the sand, or vanish into camouflage. The race between predator and survivor became the heartbeat of evolution, an endless duet between intelligence and instinct. The cause of this explosion remains one of life's great mysteries. Perhaps it was the rise of oxygen in the oceans, allowing creatures to grow larger and move faster. Perhaps it was the Hox genes, a set of genetic tools that let nature experiment with body designs. Or maybe, after billions of years of quiet rehearsal, life had simply gathered the courage and the memory to try something new. Whatever the reason, the result was a symphony. Under the shimmering light of the ancient seas, millions of tiny beings moved like dust made of stars. They swam, crawled, hunted, and reproduced. The same patterns of behavior that would shape life for billions of years to come. Every heartbeat in the Cambrian Ocean was a declaration. Life was no longer just chemistry, it was creativity. In the fossil beds of Burgess Shale in Canada and Zhenjiang in China, we can still read that chapter of Earth's diary. Every shell, every fossilized trail in ancient mud is proof that life, after coming so close to silence, chose to continue. And in a strange way, the echo of that age still lives within us. Human eyes, with their lenses and retinas, are descendants of the first cells that learned to sense light. Our bones, our nerves, our beating hearts, all trace their origins back to those tiny experiments beneath the ancient sea. The Cambrian period ended with a quiet revelation. Life had learned to see, to feel, and to dream. From here, it would lift its gaze toward the light, and for the very first time, step onto the land. After the long stillness of Earth's early ages, after endless cycles of fire and ice, the world began to awaken once more. The oceans, once the only home of life, were now overflowing with color and motion. But even the sea, vast as it was, had its limits. As life multiplied beneath the waves, space grew scarce. And some of those creatures began to look upward, toward the bright, open world above the surface, where light danced freely, where wind and dry land stretched endlessly. That was the first dream, the dream of conquering the land. Back then, Earth's surface looked nothing like it does today. There were no meadows, no trees, only red deserts of rock, scattered volcanoes and barren mountains where dust blew freely through silent valleys. Rain fell, but only to wash away the soil back into the sea. The land was empty, lifeless, and yet full of promise. And from the oceans, the first seeds of that new world began to rise. The pioneers were not animals, but plants. Around 470 million years ago, green algae began to evolve, growing simple roots that helped them cling to the bare rock. They learned how to draw water and nutrients from the ground, how to withstand ultraviolet light, and most importantly, how to photosynthesize in open air. Along the rocky shores, thin carpets of green spread out, fragile but determined, transforming the atmosphere once again. Gradually, mosses and early ferns took hold, forming the planet's very first soil. As plants spread and covered the surface, the air became humid, rains grew more frequent, and the land began to hold water. It was as if Earth had put on a new skin, and when that green skin was ready, animals followed. At first, they were tiny, crustaceans, worms, insects, crawling over moss and algae to feed. But soon, one kind of fish in the ocean developed stronger fins, limbs capable of lifting it from the water. That moment marked one of the greatest turning points in history. Life was leaving the sea. This was the Devonian and Carboniferous periods from about 419 to 299 million years ago, an age when Earth itself became a living laboratory of evolution. The oceans were still immense, but now they were only part of the story. The true adventure had begun on land. Plants flourished, towering lycopsids, ancestors of today's conifers, rose tens of meters high like green spires. Ferns with vast fronds spread wide across swampy forests, creating giant canopies that turned rain into mist. The air was thick with oxygen, so much that it was almost flammable. And with that abundance, life grew to impossible sizes. Insects, once tiny creatures of the Cambrian, became giants. The dragonfly Meganeura spread wings over 2 feet across, gliding through humid jungles. Pulmonus scorpius, a scorpion as long as a human arm, hunted under the shadows, and crawling through the muck, the millipede Arthropleura stretched nearly 2 meters long, the largest land invertebrate to ever live. The Carboniferous forests were home to these prehistoric titans, creatures without bones yet ruling by sheer size and number. Meanwhile, beneath the waters, fish evolved at breathtaking speed. It was the age of fishes when nearly every kind we know today took form: jawed fish, bony fish, cartilaginous fish, and lobe-finned fish. Among them, a few began to transform their fins into legs, the first step toward amphibians. Some developed thicker skin to withstand dry air, others formed primitive lungs to breathe outside the water. Each was an experiment, nature's way of testing new boundaries. On land, amphibians multiplied, filling swamps and riverbanks. They could swim, crawl, and breathe both water and air. Ichthyostega and Acanthostega, the most famous of them, had 4-fingered limbs and early lungs, the ancestors of all vertebrates to come. With every hesitant movement, they were writing the opening chapter of a story that would one day lead to us. But evolution never moves in a straight line. Every advance comes with a cost. As forests spread, carbon dioxide levels dropped, cooling the planet. Ice formed again at the poles, swamps dried out, isolating the creatures that depended on them. Some amphibians adapted, developing dry skin and hard-shelled eggs, and from them reptiles were born. The invention of the amniotic egg was one of nature's greatest revolutions. It allowed life to leave the sea completely, carrying the ocean within each shell. Every creature that hatched carried a memory of those ancient waters, repeating evolution's story in the womb. From single cell to fish to breathing being, Earth, at last, had become a planet of walkers. The Carboniferous world was both dream and nightmare. Forests so tall they blotted out the sky, tree trunks so massive we can hardly imagine them today. Rain fell endlessly, the ground was flooded to the knees, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in dim golden streaks. Beneath the mud, fallen trees slowly decomposed, compressed over millions of years into coal, the dark treasure humanity would one day unearth. Those black veins still hold the breath and spirit of those ancient forests. Looking back, the Devonian and Carboniferous periods were the childhood of living Earth, when the planet first learned to breathe, to sing, and to cast shade. But like every age of abundance, it ended in upheaval. By the close of the Carboniferous, the climate grew unstable. Continents collided, forming the supercontinent Pangaea. Temperatures fell, many of the giants vanished. The ancient forests withered, leaving behind endless plains of coal, the silent memory of a world that once flourished. And then, as if nature were preparing for a tragic new movement in its grand symphony, Earth entered the darkest chapter in its entire history. There are moments in evolution when time itself seems to hold its breath. When every sound fades, the forests fall silent, the oceans die, and the sky turns to ash. Moments that don't last for days or years, but for hundreds of thousands of years, a slow, suffocating agony of a living planet. About 252 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period, life on Earth faced the greatest catastrophe ever recorded, the Great Dying. Before that, the world of the Permian was nothing short of paradise. The supercontinent Pangaea stretched from pole to pole, uniting all the land masses into one colossal body. Forests had returned after the Carboniferous, giant reptiles ruled the land, insects filled the skies, fish and coral thrived in the seas. Life had reached its peak, diverse, abundant, balanced. It seemed perfect. But in nature, perfection is always the prelude to collapse. It began with fire. In what is now Siberia, a massive rift opened in Earth's crust, and for millions of years it never closed. Thousands of volcanoes erupted endlessly, flooding the land with lava and choking the air with toxic gases. The atmosphere filled with carbon dioxide and methane, transforming the planet into a colossal greenhouse. Global temperatures rose by more than 10 degrees Celsius. The oceans simmered, oxygen vanished from the water. Coral reefs collapsed, fish suffocated, and algae blooms released clouds of hydrogen sulfide, turning the seas from blue to black. Acid rain fell, forests bleached and burned, the skies darkened with smoke. Great forests that once towered for hundreds of feet were reduced to ash. Even the insects, survivors of every previous upheaval, died out in waves, marking the only time in history that an entire class of life was completely erased. Dominant land creatures like Dimetrodon, Gorgonopsids, and the early mammal ancestor, Lystrosaurus, faced extinction. Over 90% of marine species and 70% of land species vanished. The world fell silent, a silence so deep it felt as if the planet itself had stopped breathing. The oceans lay barren, no coral, no fish, only emptiness. On land, the surface was scorched and lifeless, stripped bare by acid rain. Life, once overflowing in every corner, had been reduced to scattered embers in the dark. What happened during the Permian extinction wasn't just a biological disaster. It was the total breakdown of Earth's systems. The delicate cycles of carbon, water, and oxygen collapsed. Climate swung violently between extremes. The oceans turned acidic, the ozone layer thinned, and sunlight scorched the surface like a blade of fire. The layers of red and black rock that remain today, meters thick, still tell the story. They contain volcanic ash, traces of ancient wildfires, and strange spikes in carbon levels, silent witnesses to a planet that once burned itself alive. No asteroid struck. No comet fell. The only destroyer was Earth itself. A world that had given birth to life had become its grave. When the nightmare of the great Permian extinction finally faded, Earth awoke as if from a long fever. The grey skies cleared, the poisoned seas settled, and rain washed the air clean. Forests rose from the ashes, and life, small, fragile, but unyielding, began to fill the empty spaces once again. And in that quiet dawn, the first thunderous footsteps echoed across the land. It was the Mesozoic era, the age of giants, the age of the dinosaurs. No other era in Earth's history burned with such brilliance. The climate was stable, warm, and humid. Oxygen filled the air in abundance, allowing life to grow larger and more vibrant than ever before. From the few survivors of the Permian catastrophe, one lineage of reptiles began to evolve, and soon became the undisputed rulers of the world. The Mesozoic is divided into three great periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. In the early Triassic, the planet was still scarred and barren. Pangaea remained one massive arid supercontinent where deserts stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But the rains returned, green returned, forests crept along the coasts, and small, nimble creatures like Coelophysis began to roam. Barely knee-high to a human, they were fast, alert, and daring. The prologue to a new dynasty. Millions of years later, their descendants rose to dominate the earth. In the forests, Diplodocus stretched its 30-meter neck to feed on treetops no other creature could reach. Across the plains, Triceratops stood armored in bone and horn, and in the drier lands, Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant king, emerged, the ultimate symbol of biological power. The world itself became a grand symphony of life. Some species grew as tall as buildings, others fit in the palm of a hand. Some took to the air, Pteranodon, Quetzalcoatlus, with wingspans over 10 meters, gliding like ancient steel kites. In the oceans, ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs ruled the depths like living phantoms. The ecosystems functioned in perfect harmony. Trees absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen. Animals fed, died, and nourished the soil. Rains followed the rhythm of the seasons. Rivers wound through jungles. There was no ice at the poles. The seas were warm. The air perfectly balanced. For a time, it seemed eternal. The golden age of life on Earth. Amid this balance, beauty deepened. Flowers and birds were born. Around 140 million years ago, among ferns and cycads, the first flowering plants bloomed, forging a new alliance between flora and fauna. Color, scent, and sweetness became nature's language of cooperation. Bees, butterflies, and small birds carried pollen from bloom to bloom, weaving a richer, more intricate web of life. From a branch of small, feathered dinosaurs, the first true birds emerged. Archaeopteryx, half reptile, half bird, still had teeth and claws, yet its feathered wings hinted at a future the Earth had never seen before. When those wings beat for the first time, the world changed forever. Life could now not only crawl or swim, it could fly, but beneath the surface of that long equilibrium, the seeds of change were quietly stirring. The continents began to drift apart. Pangaea cracked and gave birth to the Atlantic Ocean. Volcanoes rumbled, CO2 rose, and the climate wavered. Seas advanced and retreated. Forests shifted with the rains. And, as always, nature began to test its children once more. For over 160 million years, dinosaurs ruled the Earth, a span hundreds of times longer than the entire history of human civilization. They rose from the ashes of the Permian, endured countless generations, and built a world so balanced, so magnificent, it seemed eternal. But in every steady heartbeat of nature, change is waiting. And near the end of the Cretaceous, the skies began to look strange. Ash clouds dimmed the horizon, faint, smoky veils that whispered of an ending that could no longer be avoided. Before that fateful morning, the planet was still basking in the height of the Mesozoic's glory. The jungles were lush and endless, the oceans teemed with life, and the skies were filled with the wings of giants. Tyrannosaurus rex ruled the plains. Triceratops grazed peacefully beneath towering ferns. Pteranodon glided above the winds like ancient gods. No one, or rather no living creature, could have imagined that it was all about to end. Not through evolution, but through a stone from the heavens. It came from far, unimaginably far away, likely from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. A massive rock, more than 10 kilometers wide, hurtling through space at over 70,000 kilometers an hour. For millions of years it wandered silently, until its orbit crossed paths with Earth. There was no warning, no sign, no omen. When it entered the atmosphere, no creature below could comprehend that it was witnessing the end of its world. The impact struck where the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico now lies, the site known today as Chicxulub. In less than a second, the energy released equaled more than 10 billion nuclear bombs. A part of the Earth's surface vaporized instantly. Shock waves rippled around the globe, igniting global firestorms, leveling forests, and boiling the seas. Tsunamis, hundreds of meters high, slammed into the continents, sweeping everything in their path. Every living thing within thousands of kilometers of ground zero was obliterated in an instant. But the true catastrophe wasn't in the explosion itself, it was in the shadow that followed. When the asteroid struck, billions of tons of dust and sulfur were blasted into the atmosphere, shrouding the planet in darkness. Sunlight vanished. For months, perhaps even years, the skies remained choked with ash. Temperatures plummeted, plants withered, unable to photosynthesize, and the food chains collapsed. The dinosaurs, mighty and small alike, had nothing left to eat. They weakened, starved, and one by one fell silent. Within just a few 100,000 years, a blink of geological time, the age of the dinosaurs was over. When the last veil of ash finally drifted from the sky, Earth awoke, fragile, pale, but alive. The sun returned, faint yet warm. The oceans, once boiling in darkness, were now calm and glimmering beneath soft, newborn clouds. No more dinosaurs, no more towering ferns. The planet looked like a child after a nightmare. Stripped bare, but full of possibility. From the ashes, green returned. Weeds crept through cracks in stone, then shrubs, then forests, not the ancient jungles of the past, but new ones filled with flowering plants and seed-bearing trees. The air, once heavy with sulfur, now carried the sweet scent of resin and pollen. Birds, the last heirs of the dinosaurs, took flight over these young forests, carrying life from one place to another. Amid the warm, ashy soil, mammals, who had hidden in the shadows for tens of millions of years, began to rise. Once tiny and timid, they had lived by night, burrowed in the earth to avoid predators. But now the great rulers were gone. The empty throne left behind by the dinosaurs was the gift extinction had given them. The world after the impact was lighter, warmer, more breathable. The forests overflowed with food, and within just a few million years, mammals evolved at a pace never seen before. Some returned to the seas, becoming the ancestors of whales and seals. Some climbed trees and became primates. Others learned to hunt, turning into ancient wolves and cats. And on the plains, small creatures grew sharper teeth, stronger claws, and above all, sharper minds. Intelligence had become Earth's new survival tool. The Cenozoic era, the new age of life, was when Earth found balance again. No single species ruled unchallenged. Nature became a delicate web, herbivores, predators, birds, insects, trees, microbes, each keeping the other in check as if the planet had finally learned from its past mistakes. But the greatest change of all wasn't in size, it was in mind. Mammals, with their growing brains and ability to learn, began to live differently. They cared for their young. They cooperated, they remembered. For the first time, memory itself became a force of evolution. Earth began to hum with a new kind of sound. Not the thunderous roars of dinosaurs, but a gentler harmony. The distant calls of primates, the soft hiss of leopards, the rustle of flowering forests breathing in the wind. From canopy to plain, small footsteps spread across the planet, the first notes of a symphony still growing. Around 55 million years ago, the climate warmed. Moist air turned to clouds and rainforests stretched across the continents. It was the age of primates, High in the trees, small creatures began to grasp branches with their hands, to see forward with two eyes, judging distance, remembering paths, recognizing faces. And in those eyes, for the very first time, the world began to see itself. From them, the first primates, would come a new branch of life, carrying within it the seed of consciousness. The forests had returned, the oceans sang again, and on the new plains of Africa the sun rose each morning as if the world had never known memory. But somewhere among the creatures still hiding in the trees, a small species was quietly changing, not through muscle or speed, but through thought. They learned to watch, to predict, to imagine. The first faint sparks of intelligence. It was they, the half-animal, half-human beings, who would begin the newest and perhaps strangest chapter in Earth's story, the arrival of humankind. Around 4 million years ago, on the dry plains of East Africa, once lush rainforest, now open grassland, the climate began to shift. Trees retreated, shade vanished, and in the golden heat of the savannah, one small creature was forced to adapt. Instead of running, it stood up. That single motion, the act of rising, changed the destiny of the planet. This species was called Australopithecus, the southern ape. They had no claws, no fangs, no speed, no strength to match predators. But when their hands were freed from supporting their bodies, they became tools of something new, hands that could hold, grasp, and experiment. On a layer of volcanic ash at Laetoli, the footprints of Australopithecus afarensis still remain after millions of years. The first steps taken fully upright, arms swinging gently for balance. No one knows if they understood how different they were from other creatures, but in that moment, Earth had gained a being that could look forward, a creature whose thoughts began to grow from its movements. They lived in small groups, gathering around water sources, picking fruit, digging roots, and sharing food. They couldn't speak, but they could shout, gesture, and communicate with glances and cries. In every warning call, in every act of sharing, the seeds of language and memory were beginning to sprout. They didn't know they were starting something extraordinary, but nature did. The planet was experimenting with a new kind of awareness. And after hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error, a new species emerged from them, Homo habilis, the handy human. If Australopithecus was the one who stood, Homo habilis was the one who made. In the Olduvai Gorge, shards of stone chipped with purpose still lie scattered, the first evidence of a thinking hand. These tools weren't for building, but for surviving, scraping meat from bone, cracking nuts, cutting branches. Yet with every precise strike came something revolutionary, an understanding of cause and effect. That was the moment instinct began to yield to reason. When Homo habilis picked up the first stone, they didn't just use it, they remembered they could use it again. That memory drew the first line between animal and human. They began to plan, to learn from mistakes, to imitate what they saw. Their brains grew larger, more intricate, capable of reflection. For the first time in Earth's history, a being existed that could think about its own actions. Life for Homo habilis was still harsh. They hunted small animals, scavenged carcasses, and huddled in caves to escape the storms. But in their dark eyes there was a new light, not just the reflection of fire, but the glow of awareness. When a child learned to shape a stone by watching a parent, it wasn't just copying movement, it was copying intention. Knowledge began to pass not through genes but through experience. the first inheritance of learning in all of life's history. Australopithecus eventually disappeared, returning to the earth like so many before them. But their legacy endured. The upright stance, the free hand, and the mind that could remember and learn. Homo habilis carried that flame forward, beginning a new tradition no longer rooted in instinct, but in consciousness. From the motion of a wrist to the strike of a stone to the birth of the idea of a tool, this chain of evolution laid the foundation for everything humanity would one day create: art, mathematics, language, philosophy, and belief. From the wind-swept plains of Africa, their descendants took another step forward. Their hands grew steadier, their posture taller, and the fire of curiosity within them burned brighter. A new species emerged, Homo erectus, the upright human. They didn't just inherit tools from their ancestors, they began to master the forces of nature itself. And one day, during a raging storm, they saw it: fire. Where other creatures fled in fear, they stopped and watched. The same flames that terrified all life now drew them closer. Hands that once shaped stone now reached out to grasp glowing embers. For the first time in the history of Earth, a living being did not fear the fire. It kept it. It was Homo erectus who first learned to command flame. They knew how to dry meat, to stay warm through the night, to gather around its light. Fire didn't just drive away predators. It drove away the darkness within their minds. From those nights onward, they were no longer creatures merely surviving. They had begun to truly live. At first, they likely carried coals from wildfires, keeping them alive in hollow branches or piles of ash. Gradually, they learned to tend the flame, adding wood, blowing air, guarding it till dawn. Keeping the fire alive became a sacred duty, perhaps humanity's first act of shared culture. Each night, small groups gathered around the glow, sharing food, warmth, and silent stories told through eyes and gestures. In that golden light, the first sense of community was born. Fire changed everything. It turned night into day, fear into strength. Wild beasts kept their distance. Cold climates were no longer death sentences. Most importantly, it cooked food. Cooking meant easier digestion, more energy, and a body that could redirect that energy toward the brain. And so began a new cycle of evolution. Fire fed the mind, and the mind protected the fire. Archaeologists have found layers of ash, charcoal, and scorched bones in ancient caves, from Kubi Fora in Kenya to Jokudian in China. Proof that early humans didn't just stumble upon fire, they controlled it. The burn marks were consistent, the rocks evenly heated, evidence of purpose, not accident. From that mastery, Homo erectus spread across the continents, out of Africa, into Asia and Europe, carrying with them both their flame and a faint, growing belief that light could travel wherever they went. Fire also became the first symbol of the sacred. When they looked into the red glow, they saw something alive yet dying, destructive yet protective. Perhaps for the first time they sensed invisible forces beyond their grasp. And from that awe, the seed of spirituality was planted. Fire became the heart of ritual, of gathering, of memory. Where there was fire, there were people. At night, as the wind howled across the plains, they sat together around the flickering blaze. Light danced across their faces and reflected in eyes that now held something new, awareness of self. Under a star-filled sky, Homo erectus didn't just gaze upward, they began to wonder. The fire burning in their hearts seemed to echo the stars above, and deep inside they may have felt a connection between themselves and the universe. But fire's greatest gift was time. In darkness, creatures knew only the present: to eat, sleep, run, hide. With fire, night no longer marked the end of the day. It became its continuation. They could now sit, wait, think, and remember. For the first time, life had a concept of yesterday and tomorrow. The flame was humanity's first clock, measured not in hours, but in warmth and light. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo erectus still lacked true language, yet they had begun to pass on knowledge through action, imitation, and memory.
Every child raised in the glow of the fire learned how to keep it alive, how to spark it again, how to survive.
Those memories, carried through thousands of generations, slowly shaped what it meant to be human. From the perspective of geology, the fire of Homo erectus was just a brief spark in the planet's long night. But from the perspective of life, it was the first true flame of intelligence. A creature had learned to master an element, and with it began to shape the future of the world. One night, long after Homo erectus first learned to tame the flame, that same fire still burned, but those gathered around it were no longer silent beings. They looked at one another, gestured, spoke sounds that carried meaning, and slowly they learned to name the world. That was the moment Homo sapien, the one who thinks, appeared. And from that instant on, Earth didn't just breathe and multiply, it began to dream. Around 300,000 years ago, in Africa, Homo sapiens was born. They weren't as strong as their Neanderthal cousins, nor armed with claws or fangs. Their advantage was something invisible, a brain wired for imagination. Inside it, memory was no longer just storage, it was organization, comparison, connection. While other animals reacted only to the present, humans could recall the past and imagine the future. That ability made consciousness the most powerful weapon life had ever created. Language was the first great breakthrough. When sounds gained meaning, knowledge could travel without sight. Fire, water, beast, we. Each word was a capsule of memory, a thought that could be shared and carried. When Homo sapiens spoke, they didn't just exchange information, they created shared reality.
Through language, the world was born a second time, this time inside the human mind.
Then around 70,000 years ago, something miraculous unfolded: the cognitive revolution. Small groups scattered across Africa began crafting symbols, carvings on stone, necklaces of shells and teeth. These weren't mere ornaments. They were unspoken language, expressions of identity and meaning. When a creature decorates itself, buries its dead, or paints its walls, it has stepped beyond nature and into history. The caves of Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain, painted more than 30,000 years ago, still echo with those beginnings. By torchlight, our ancestors painted bison, horses, deer, and the outlines of their own hands. These were not just drawings, they were prayers. Each line was a conversation with the unseen, with something they felt but could not name: spirits, ancestors, the memory of the earth itself. Those stone walls were humanity's first pages. On them, people recorded not just what they saw, but what they felt. In every painting there is fear, hope, and longing for survival. By depicting the animal, they believed they could call its spirit, shape its fate. For the first time, consciousness was used not merely to live, but to transform the world. The fire once carried by Homo erectus had now become the light of the human mind. Under that glow, Homo sapiens told stories of ancestors, spirits, and dreams. And as stories were told, collective memory was born. Knowledge no longer died with the individual, it lived on in the community. Each generation passed the tale forward, adding, imagining, expanding. Humanity had created culture.
What truly set humans apart was not intelligence alone, but belief.
They believed that storms had meaning, that death wasn't the end, that spirits lived in stones, in wind, in fire. From that awe came the first faith. Not organized religion as we know it, but a dialogue between people and the universe. They thanked the rain, feared the thunder, prayed for sunrise. In every ritual they declared one truth: we are part of the world, and the world is part of us. During this age, Homo sapiens began to leave Africa. They crossed the Middle East, spread into Asia and Europe, and braved icy seas to reach the Americas. Their footprints stretched from the Sahara to the Siberian steppe, and wherever they went, fire followed. Each pile of ashes, each flint spear, each cave painting whispered the same message of existence. We were here. But their journey was more than a migration of bodies. It was a migration of memory. Every fire they kindled carried a story. Every story told beside the flames became a fragment of something greater, the growing tapestry of human history. Then the ice began to melt. After the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, Earth changed its face once more. The climate grew warmer, rains returned, rivers overflowed their banks, forests spread over lands once frozen, and herds of animals roamed freely across the newborn green plains. For humanity, this wasn't just a shift in nature, it was the turning point of destiny. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had been wanderers, hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons and the migrations of wild herds. They carried fire, memory, and the stories told beside its glow. But somewhere, it was as if the earth itself called them to stop. Not from exhaustion, but because they had discovered something miraculous. The ground could give birth to food. In the Fertile Crescent, the cradle stretching from the Jordan Valley to Mesopotamia, early humans discovered that the grains scattered by chance would grow back. And when they stayed long enough to watch, they learned something even more profound. The land would feed them if they learned to care for it. Thus, the first seeds of agriculture, and civilization, were planted. The world's first true village appeared, Jericho in the Jordan Valley, over 10,000 years ago. From afar, it seemed humble, a few dozen mud brick houses, stone walls encircling them, a well at the center. But Jericho was a milestone, the dawn of settlement. Humans no longer lived in temporary shelters. They built permanent homes. They stored grain, collected water, and for the first time felt something new, the sense of home. In Jericho, for the first time in 4 million years of evolution, humans stopped, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. They began organizing the world around them. Inside the walls was life. Beyond them, the wild, a thin boundary between humanity and the universe. They were no longer merely surviving. They were building. From Jericho, the idea of the village spread outward. About 9,000 years ago in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a strange settlement arose, Çatalhöyük. There were no streets, no gates, no outer walls. Homes were packed together, sharing walls. People entered through the roof, climbing up and down by ladders. Inside, they painted scenes of hunting, farming, and ritual. Each home was a miniature world, where the living and the dead coexisted, as ancestors were buried beneath the floors. Çatalhöyük was not just a place to live, it was a monument of memory. Each house contained layers of ash, soil, and human remains, time compacted into architecture. When the fire in the hearth went out, a child would light it again in the same spot, continuing the warmth of generations past. It was here that humanity first learned the meaning of long time. No longer did they think only of the next hunt or next season, but of next year's harvest and their children's future. With agriculture, the world changed completely. Abundant food allowed populations to grow. Small communities became societies. Some people farmed, others crafted pottery or guarded the granaries. Labor divided, roles emerged, and from them, organization was born. Someone had to store the food, count the harvest, and decide how to share it. And thus, the first power structures took root, along with belief. Temples began to rise. In Çatalhöyük, walls were decorated with bull skulls, horns, and statues of round-bodied women, symbols of the Mother Earth.
To them, the soil wasn't just a place to live, but a being that gave them life.
When they planted seeds, they believed they were performing an offering to the Mother. Agriculture was not merely a technique, it was a religion of the earth. The birth of settlement marked the beginning of everything: ownership, territory, community, family, and conflict. Once humans had land, they had something to defend. Once they learned to store, they learned to divide. But above all, settlement gave them a gift their nomadic ancestors never had: lasting memory. In the past, each generation left only footprints. Now they left walls, pots, seeds, and ashes, traces you could touch. Memory was no longer just a story. It became artifact. For the first time, humans began to build their own past. Jericho and Çatalhöyük were only the first echoes in a long symphony of civilization. From them, humanity began weaving a web of settlements stretching from the Levant to the Tigris, from the Nile to the Indus. They were just the first seed, but from those seeds the entire history of humankind began to bloom. And then, about 5,000 years ago, that seed grew into the first great tree of civilization, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq. There, humanity built Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Eridu, the very first cities in human history. They called this land Sumer. From the small riverside villages, humankind stepped into a new age. They learned to make laws, to worship, to write, to organize, and to build social hierarchies. Order and belief were no longer born from nature. They were shaped by human hands and minds. Everything began with water. The two rivers brought both fertility and destruction. To survive, the Sumerians had to master nature, digging canals, building levees, dividing water. That required planning, and planning required leadership. From among them, the wisest and most respected, priests, chiefs, and record-keepers, became kings. Yet to be obeyed, a king could not be merely human. He had to be a child of the gods. That was when religion became politics. The Sumerians believed every city belonged to a specific deity: Uruk to Inanna, goddess of love and war; Nippur to Enlil, lord of the winds; Eridu to Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom. At each city's heart rose a massive stepped tower, the ziggurat, a staircase between heaven and earth. Beneath its base were markets, granaries, and homes. Above its summit, incense curled toward the sky. Whenever people saw that smoke, they knew the universe was in balance. On clay tablets carved with wedge-shaped symbols, what we now call cuneiform, the Sumerians recorded grain rations, taxes, oaths, and hymns to their gods. From that moment, human memory stepped out of the mind and became text. They didn't just speak their history, they wrote it. Around the same time, another civilization rose along the Nile, Egypt. If Sumer built its cities out of mud brick, Egypt built its kingdom out of faith. Each year the Nile swelled, spread its silt, and then withdrew, leaving rich soil, a perfect rhythm, like the breath of the divine. Egyptians believed that life and death, day and night, the rising and falling of the river, all reflected Ma'at, the sacred order of the cosmos. The pharaoh, the great house, was not just a ruler, but a living god. He was Horus in life, Osiris in death, the bridge between heaven and earth. When the pharaoh spoke, it was the voice of the divine. When he died, the entire kingdom built pyramids to send his soul back to the stars. Massive stones weighing tens of tons were stacked in perfect silence, as if humanity itself was reaching for immortality. Sumer and Egypt, two poles of the same idea that cosmic order could be created by human hands. In Sumer, temples were built for the gods to descend. In Egypt, pyramids were built for humans to ascend. One reached upward, the other downward. Yet both sprang from the same yearning to master the infinite. And strangely, within the temples meant for gods, humanity discovered itself. To build ziggurats, they learned geometry. To divide the land, they learned surveying. To record offerings, they invented writing. And when they wrote, they realized they could shape the world with symbols, just as the gods shaped it with words. Those first states were more than places to live. They were engines of ideas. Every brick, every idol, every line chiseled in stone declared the same truth. We do not merely exist in nature, we organize it. At the dawn of civilization, when ziggurats touched the sky and the pyramids caught the sunlight of the Nile, humanity had no idea it was standing before a discovery that would forever change the order of the world. A small invention, like just the merging of two soft, ordinary metals, but powerful enough to rewrite history, copper and tin, fused together in fire, gave birth to something radiant and enduring. The world entered the Bronze Age, and from the red glow of the forge, power itself was born. No one knows who first melted metal. Maybe it was a potter who noticed a lump of ore changing color in the kiln. Maybe it was a child tossing a shiny stone into the coals and watching it melt like blood. From that moment on, fire was no longer just for cooking or warmth. It became a force of creation and destruction. Around 3,300 years before Christ, the lands of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley transformed together. Humanity learned to smelt copper, then to mix it with tin, creating bronze harder, sharper, and stronger than anything before. With bronze came swords, spears, armor, axes, statues, and bells. The world stepped out of the Stone Age and into the age of metal, and fire became the heart of civilization. Those who mastered fire, the blacksmiths, became keepers of power. In every city they were like sorcerers of reality, turning raw ore into tools and soil into weapons. From that point on, the difference between nations was no longer about crops or rivers, but about who had the better weapons. Human history began to smell of smoke, of blood, and of molten metal. The Bronze Age was the age of the first empires. In Mesopotamia, the city-states of Sumer were united under Sargon of Akkad, who founded the first empire in recorded history, around 2,300 years before Christ. He conquered with bronze-clad soldiers, disciplined and organized, an army that could write, measure, and count. From then on, war became a profession. In Egypt, pharaohs Thutmose III and Ramses II led bronze-charioted armies into the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, the first great battle ever recorded in detail. In Anatolia, the Hittites mastered the art of forging iron earlier than anyone else, paving the way for the coming Iron Age. In China, the Shang dynasty began casting massive bronze weapons and ritual bells, inscribing words on bones, blending fire, metal, and writing into a single sacred ceremony. But with the brilliance of civilization came the shadow of war. Once, humans killed each other with stone, crude, close, almost personal. Now they could strike with the gleam of metal. Every sword was both a work of art and a death sentence. In the forge, creation and destruction shared the same breath. When a blacksmith raised his hammer, he was shaping the future, or ending it. The Bronze Age was also the age of heroes. Gilgamesh of Uruk, Achilles of Mycenae, and the warriors of ancient Egypt and China all carried the same image. Humanity transformed into legend through battle. For the first time, history and myth became one. Tales of glory were carved into stone, cast into vessels, and sung beside the firelight. Under the glow of bronze, art, trade, and religion flourished. Metal did not just create weapons, it forged jewelry, bells, and instruments that resonated through temples like the voice of the gods. Wherever bronze shone, there too was the ritual of power. Like every great peak before it, the Bronze Age could not escape the law of decline. Around 1200 years before Christ, the ancient world seemed eternal. From Egypt to Mycenae, from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, mighty empires were bound together through trade, writing, and power. Thousands of years of fragile peace had built an almost global system, a web where copper, tin, turquoise, and ideas flowed across seas, deserts, and distant mountains. People believed that order had been achieved, that humanity had finally found its rhythm. And then, within a single, short century, everything collapsed. It wasn't one nation that fell, but the entire civilized world, as if the intricate web of humanity had suddenly lost its central thread. Archaeologists call it the Bronze Age collapse, one of the greatest mysteries in human history. Between 1200 and 1100 years before Christ, the great powers fell one after another. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia vanished from the map. Mycenae, the kingdom of warriors later celebrated by Homer, was abandoned. Ugarit, the great port of the Mediterranean, went silent. Among the last surviving clay tablets, one desperate letter was found. "The enemy is here. My ships are gone. Send reinforcements if there is still time." That was the final message. And the world it belonged to never answered back. Even Egypt, the most enduring civilization of all, could not escape. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Ramses III carved scenes of battle against a strange enemy, the Sea Peoples, migrants from the north who arrived by ships, bringing families, livestock, and weapons. Who they were remains debated, people from the Aegean, from Anatolia, or refugees driven by drought. Whatever their origin, they brought something more devastating than war, the mass migration of a world losing its balance. The collapse did not come from a single battle, but from a chain of breakdowns that rippled across the world. Trade routes froze, shipping lanes emptied, the supply of tin, the soul of bronze, ran dry. Without metal, no tools could be made, no weapons forged. Armies disbanded, cities were deserted, and people retreated to the mountains and forests. The network that once tied dozens of civilizations together was now a collection of broken strands drifting in the dark. Modern scholars still debate the cause. Perhaps it was climate change, years of drought across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying crops and forcing migrations. Perhaps earthquakes struck again and again, toppling ports and fortresses, or perhaps the system had become too dependent on international trade, so connected that when one link broke, the entire structure fell apart. The world was too intertwined to stand alone, and so it collapsed together. What followed was a void, a hole in human civilization. After millennia of progress in writing, mathematics, architecture, and music, people suddenly forgot. In Greece, writing disappeared for nearly 4 centuries. In Anatolia, the cities of the Hittites were swallowed by weeds. In Mesopotamia, libraries were abandoned and cuneiform tablets shattered into dust, their language unreadable. For hundreds of years, humanity lived in a time without memory. Regions that once blazed with light, Mycenae, Troy, Hattusa, Ugarit, Babylon, became piles of broken stone. Only a few fragments tried to hold on to the thread of knowledge, Egyptian priests copying old sacred texts, Assyrian scribes preserving tablets like treasures. But most of the world slipped into a dark age, where myth replaced history, and what had once been real became legend. It was in that darkness that humanity's memory split in two. The Greeks would later tell stories of Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon, never realizing they were echoes of real Mycenaean warriors. The Egyptians would rewrite their past as if theirs were the only kingdom left. The truth of that era was buried beneath the dust, leaving behind only shards of pottery, broken inscriptions, and a silence that lasted centuries. A silence where a once brilliant civilization vanished inside the very web it had built. After the flame of the Bronze Age went out, the world fell into silence. Temples that once reached toward the heavens were reduced to rubble. Writing vanished, art grew mute, and humanity's memory seemed wiped clean. Yet, like every long winter in Earth's history, that darkness was only a pause before life rose again. Stronger, wiser, and more radiant than before. And then, from the ashes of fallen civilizations, new empires began to rise, in different corners of the world, almost at the same time, as if the planet itself had awakened. In the West, across the rocky peninsulas of the Mediterranean, the Greeks learned once more to tell stories, to sing, and to rebuild memory through the power of the spoken word. While Egypt and Babylon still trusted their temples and tablets, Greece revived itself through voice and legend. Tales of Achilles, Odysseus, and the gods were sung in the open air, passed down through generations. And within those myths, they rediscovered something deeper than divinity, humanity itself. When cities were rebuilt, the Greeks did not raise ziggurats, they built polis, city-states. Power no longer belonged to kings or gods, but to the community. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. Each was a small universe where citizens debated law, war, art, and philosophy. From these gatherings, politics was born, and with it, philosophy, art, and science. Meanwhile, far to the east, another empire rose, one wiser and more sophisticated than any before. Persia. Under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century before Christ, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from India to the Mediterranean, embracing countless peoples, languages, and faiths. Unlike the conquerors who came before, the Persians ruled not only with the sword, but with tolerance. They allowed each culture to keep its gods and customs so long as they honored the greater order. It was the world's first empire of diversity, where power came not only from fire and metal, but from organization and trust. To the south, beyond the Himalayas, the Indus and Ganges rivers came alive again. Here, ancient India, blended faith, mathematics, and philosophy into a spiritual system unlike any other. From the Vedic culture came the Upanishads, sacred texts exploring the nature of the soul and the universe. While the West looked outward to conquer the world, India turned inward to conquer the self. They searched for order, not in society, but in the spirit. And farther east still, another world was weaving its own grand design, China. After the fall of the Shang and the rise of the Zhou, the land entered the spring and autumn and warring states periods, a time of turmoil, but also of brilliance. Amid war and chaos, thinkers like Confucius, Laozi, Mozi, and Sun Tzu emerged, laying the foundation for all Eastern philosophy. They did not build pyramids, they built moral order. Confucius taught the art of humanity and harmony. Laozi spoke of the Tao, the hidden path beneath all things. Mozi preached universal love, and Sun Tzu saw warfare as an art of the mind. While the West sought reason, the East sought balance. Strangely, all these centers, Greece, Persia, India, and China, rose almost simultaneously with no contact between them, as though guided by the same pulse of history. Modern historians call this the axial age, the era when human consciousness awakened across the world. For the first time, people began asking not only how to live, but why to live. From the ruins of the Bronze Age, humanity rebuilt not just its cities, but its soul. In Greece, Socrates asked, "What is good?" In India, the Buddha asked, "How can one be freed from suffering?" In China, Confucius asked, "How can a ruler govern and keep the people's hearts?" Three questions are different in form yet born from the same root, the search for meaning in the universe. If the Bronze Age was the age of fire, this was the age of light. Fire forged weapons, light forged ideas. For the first time, power no longer lay solely in the hands of those who wielded the sword, but in those who held the word. From Greece to China, systems of knowledge emerged: mathematics, logic, astronomy, music, law, medicine. Humanity began to see that the universe followed patterns, and that they could be understood. The gods slowly stepped back, making room for reason. And yet, paradoxically, reason made the world feel more sacred than ever. The classical empires were not a new beginning, but a rebirth of memory. Each land chose its own path. Greece sought freedom, Persia sought order, India sought enlightenment, China sought harmony. But all together they began writing a new chapter in the same book, the history of human consciousness. And among those chapters of rebirth, one civilization rose as if to gather everything that came before, not into philosophy or myth, but into absolute order, carved in stone, built in blood, and bound by law. While the East searched for balance and enlightenment, the West chose another path, the path of power, discipline, and eternity. They gave it a single name, a word that became the symbol of an entire age: Rome. No one knows exactly when that dream began. Legend says the city of Rome was founded in 753 years before Christ by Romulus, a child raised by a wolf in the wilderness. From that myth, Rome grew with the instinct of an outcast fighting to survive. They were not the most brilliant nor the most creative, but they possessed something no civilization before them had ever sustained: the will to organize. The Greeks dreamed of beauty, the Egyptians dreamed of immortality, but the Romans dreamed of order. They believed that order was the only thing standing between the world and chaos. Every structure, every law, every army and road all existed for one purpose: to make that order last forever. At first, Rome was nothing more than a small town by the Tiber River, but by the 5th century before Christ, they began to expand, defeating their neighbors then uniting the Italian peninsula. They conquered not just with swords, but with systems. When they took a city, they didn't burn it. They built roads, divided land, constructed bridges, established law, and assimilated the people. Yesterday's enemy became tomorrow's citizen. Rome did not destroy. It absorbed. After defeating Carthage in the 3 Punic Wars, Rome turned the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum, our sea. From Spain to Syria, from Egypt to Britain, people spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, but all bowed to the same symbol, the Roman eagle. At the heart of this world, Rome was more than a city, it was an idea. Roman roads spread across continents, carrying soldiers, merchants, and messages back to the capital like veins returning blood to the heart. Every paving stone carried the silent desire to defy time. All roads lead to Rome was not just a proverb, it was political truth. And with the roads came law. The Romans understood that the true strength of an empire lay not in its armies, but in its rules. They created the 12 tables, which evolved into vast systems of civil law, defining rights, property, citizenship, marriage, and inheritance. From these came the foundation of Western legal thought, the belief in rule by law. Yet Rome was not only a political machine, it was a storyteller in stone. Its temples, arenas, and palaces still stand today not merely because of engineering, but because of will. Every arch, every column, every colossal block of marble declares the order of Rome is eternal. When Rome shifted from republic to empire, with Augustus as its first emperor in 27 years before Christ, it entered a golden age. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted nearly 2 centuries. There were no great wars, no chaos, only construction, trade, and cultural expansion. Beneath the Roman sun, it seemed the world had finally reached perfect stability. But it was precisely then that the first cracks appeared. When humanity starts believing it has touched eternity, it forgets the passage of time. In a distant province called Judea, a carpenter named Jesus spoke of a kingdom not built of stone, but of spirit. And within Rome itself, philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius began to wonder whether power alone could truly hold the human soul. In the centuries that followed, Rome would divide and eventually fall. But even as the last stones of the Colosseum crumbled, the dream of eternal order did not die. For Rome had built more than an empire. It had built the way humanity thinks about the world. But no empire ever falls in a single day. And neither did Rome. From the height of Pax Romana, the Roman peace, cracks had already begun to spread from within. The walls that once seemed eternal began to fracture at their base. The laws that once upheld order slowly turned into chains too heavy to bear. When Augustus built his unified empire, he could never have imagined that 3 centuries later its very greatness would become the weight that dragged the world down. Beyond the borders, nomadic tribes, the Goths, Vandals, and Huns, began to move. Within the empire, the rich withdrew to their estates, leaving peasants to shoulder crushing taxes. The empire had grown too vast for anyone to control. When rebellion broke out in the east, the west barely heard of it. When war erupted in Africa, wheat never reached Rome. The treasury dried up, and soldiers, once the proud bearers of the Roman eagle, began to sell their swords to anyone who could pay. Around the 4th century after Christ, one decision changed the course of history. Emperor Constantine moved the capital east to Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. From that moment, the empire split in 2, east and west. In the east, wealth and scholarship continued to flourish. In the west, the old heart of Rome, decay set in. Roads cracked Arenas fell silent. Once vibrant provinces became ghostly fields where only the sound of church bells drifted through the fog. The old world of laws, forums, philosophy, and marble began to dissolve like sand. By the year 476 after Christ, the unthinkable happened. Odoacer, a Gothic general, marched into Rome unopposed. He deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West. No blood was spilled, no heroic battle was fought, only silence and the closing of an age. Those who lived through it didn't know they were witnessing the fall of the Roman Empire. To them, it was just another ruler replaced. But from the view of history, it was the moment the old world died. Rome faded, slowly, heavily, inevitably. When the Roman eagle fell, Europe sank into a vacuum. Roads connecting cities were abandoned. Aqueducts, baths, and libraries, symbols of urban civilization, rotted away. Trade halted. Money lost its value. Populations dwindled. Great cities shrank into lonely villages among ruins. The Germanic tribes divided the remains of Rome, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in Gaul, Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Each region became a fragment, no longer sharing a common language, law, or symbol. The first global order of humanity had disintegrated. Later generations would call this the Dark Ages, not because people had become ignorant, but because the light of knowledge had been severed. Libraries burned. Greek and Roman manuscripts were forgotten. Writing survived only in monasteries. Yet within that darkness another flame flickered, the flame of faith. After Rome's fall, power left the hands of emperors and found refuge in the church. When there was no king to rule, people turned to God to guide. The church became the heart not only of religion, but of learning. Within cold stone walls, monks quietly copied ancient books, taught Latin, observed the stars, healed the sick, and preserved the fragile memory of an entire civilization. Yet while Europe sank into centuries of darkness after the fall of Rome, the world itself did not grow dim, because history has never been written on just one half of the earth. As the West lost its torch of knowledge, the East kindled new lamps, illuminating an age that Europe would later call the Dark Ages, but which, for the rest of humanity, was an age of brilliance. Around the 7th century after Christ, in the blazing deserts of Arabia, a man named Muhammad retreated to the cave of Hira and heard a voice call out, "Read in the name of your Lord." From that moment, Islam was born, not only as a religion, but as a civilization. Within just a few centuries, armies and scholars carrying both faith and knowledge spread across the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, India, and even toward the borders of China. They understood something profound. True power lay not in the sword, but in wisdom. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, was built. There, Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated, studied, and expanded upon. When Europe forgot Aristotle, Ibn Sina read him and wrote commentaries that redefined philosophy. When the West lost geometry, Al-Khwarizmi gave birth to algebra. While monks in Europe still saw the stars as omens, Al-Battani calculated the moon's orbit, and Ibn al-Haytham laid the foundations of optics. Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba shone like jewels in the night of the world. The Library of Cordoba held over 400,000 manuscripts, more than all of Europe combined. Numbers, maps, medicine, and theories that shape modern science were rekindled by those lamps of the Islamic Golden Age. Farther east, China entered its own Golden Age under the Tang and Song dynasties, an era where knowledge, art, and technology merged into a civilization unlike any other. While the West struggled to remember Rome, the Chinese already had paper, printing, the compass, gunpowder, and paper money. Chang'an, the Tang capital, became the global center of the 8th century, a city where scholars from India, Persia, Japan, and Korea gathered and exchanged ideas. Along the Silk Road, goods were only the surface. What truly traveled were thoughts and spirits. In quiet study halls, brushes moved over paper, writing verses that would echo for 1,000 years. Before my bed, the moonlight shines like frost. I lift my head and think of home afar. Libai. Here, poetry was philosophy, art was politics, and wisdom was sacred. Meanwhile, in the lush south, where the Mekong winds through jungles and plains, the Khmer built Angkor, a stone capital that mirrored the cosmos itself. Temples like Angkor Wat, Bayon, and Ta Prohm were not merely houses of worship, they were maps of the universe. While Europe built monasteries out of fear, the Khmer built temples to reflect heaven and earth. In every carved block of sandstone, they believed they were restoring sacred order, not just honoring the gods, but becoming one with them. At the same time, across the ocean, the Maya had measured the solar year at 365.2420 days, off by less than 10 seconds from modern calculations. They raised pyramids at Palenque, Tikal, and Chichen Itza, where every stair marked a day, every corner aligned with the movement of stars. To them, the universe was not a place humans lived in. It was a living being that breathed with them. Time had a soul, and each cycle was a heartbeat of creation. So when Europe called those centuries dark, the rest of the world was still bathed in light. Perhaps somewhere at a library of Cordoba, in a quiet monastery beneath Chinese pines, or in a Maya observatory deep in the jungle, that light still burns quietly, waiting for humanity to remember how bright it once shone. After centuries of faith and shadow, Europe began to awaken, not with the sound of war trumpets, but in quiet rooms where scholars bent over ancient manuscripts, brushing away the dust of time from Latin and Greek pages, fragments left from Rome, Athens, and Alexandria. From those faded letters, a new light slowly seeped through the thick walls of the Middle Ages. They called it the Renaissance, rebirth. But it was more than the rebirth of knowledge. It was the rebirth of humanity itself. The Renaissance didn't arrive like lightning. It came like dawn, slow, gentle, unnoticed, until its glow filled the sky. By the 14th century, merchants, scholars, and artists in Italy, in Florence, Venice, Pisa, and Rome, began collecting ancient books, statues, and ideas. When the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, Greek scholars fled westward, carrying with them the works of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and Hippocrates. Texts once thought lost returned, like distant memories awakening from sleep. Yet, what people rediscovered was not only knowledge, it was themselves. During the Middle Ages, they had lived for God alone, their souls belonging to heaven, their bodies mere vessels. But the ancient manuscripts whispered something radical, that humanity itself was the center of the world, not out of pride, but out of purpose, not only to pray, but to understand, to explore, to create. A new philosophy was born, humanism. People no longer knelt only to plead, they stood to wonder. If God gave us reason, they said, then perhaps he meant for us to use it. In the workshops of Florence, Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines, robots, and the inner map of the human body, as if seeing the world through divine eyes. In Rome, Michelangelo carved David, a man standing alone, needing no miracle, no protection, only will, intellect, and beauty. In Venice, Titian and Tintoretto painted light itself as if it were the language of God. And in Florence, Brunelleschi built the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, a feat his peers called impossible. Yet he did it, not with miracles, but with mathematics, geometry, and faith in human ingenuity. From there, art, science, and philosophy intertwined, all seeking the same thing: beauty in nature, in reason, and in the soul. But it wasn't only artists. Scientists became poets of truth. When Copernicus declared that Earth was not the center of the universe, the world trembled. For over 1,000 years, people had believed everything revolved around them. Now they faced the staggering truth that humanity was but a speck among the stars. And yet, instead of despair, they felt awe. If the universe was infinite, then so was knowledge. After Copernicus came Galileo, peering through a small telescope and discovering that the moon was not perfect, but scarred. And he whispered, "And yet it moves." Then came Kepler, revealing the laws of planetary motion, Vesalius mapping the human body, and Newton binding heaven and earth under the same law. Each of them did the same brave thing. They opened their eyes and saw the world as it truly was. The Renaissance was not only an age of knowledge, but of freedom, of the mind and the spirit. People began to question, and from questioning, they created. They asked about God, about power, about meaning itself. They didn't abandon faith, they sought to understand it through reason. The churches still stood, but inside them now echoed not only prayers, but also the music of Bach, the poetry of Dante, the laughter of Erasmus, and the voices of those who dared to say, "We were born to understand." And discovery didn't stay confined to the mind. It set sail on the oceans. As ancient maps and ideas revealed a vast and mysterious world, ships departed from the ports of Portugal and Spain, carrying compasses, charts, and dreams. Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Magellan circled the globe, and Vasco da Gama reached India. After millennia of gazing at the heavens in prayer, humankind had finally learned to touch the horizon. After the centuries of Renaissance and discovery, humanity began to see the world with new eyes. The eyes of a creator who no longer feared creation itself. If the Middle Ages believed that God controlled all things and the Renaissance believed that humans could understand the world, then the 18th century took a far bolder step. Humans began to believe they could change the world. It was the moment when knowledge left the page and turned into machines, smoke, and the sound of metal. The world, once ruled by the rhythms of seasons, wind, and sunlight, now began to move to the rhythm of gears. It all started with something small: coal. Deep in the mines of Britain, people discovered that this black stone could boil water, create steam, drive wheels, and make iron move. When James Watt improved the steam engine in 1769, he didn't just invent a machine, he changed the nature of time itself. Before that, work followed nature. Farmers rose with the dawn and rested when the sun set. But in the factories of Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, the sun no longer mattered. Time belonged to the machine. The ticking clock replaced the sky, dividing the day into hours, the hours into minutes, each one measured, bought, and sold. From that moment, time became a commodity. The first chimneys poured black smoke into the English sky. The land itself seemed to turn into a living creature, powered by steam and sweat. Textile mills, foundries, railroads, and iron bridges grew like forests of metal, swallowing fields and rivers. The screech of wheels, the pounding of hammers, the hiss of steam. This was the new music of the world. Humans no longer lived in nature. They created a second nature of their own. Through machines, they did what no generation before them had dared. They bent the laws of the earth to serve their will. A horse could pull a carriage for a day. A steam engine could pull a train for miles in an hour. A weaver could make a few yards of cloth by hand. A mechanical loom could make hundreds. The physical power once reserved for gods now rested in human hands. But with that power came a price. Industrial cities rose like islands of iron and smoke. Beneath the chimneys, 10-year-old children worked 16-hour days. Adults died from coal dust, and the Thames turned thick and black. Amid the glow of the machines, the human soul darkened. The 18th and 19th centuries became the strangest in history. The era when humankind grew both greater and smaller than ever before. They conquered nature, yet became prisoners of their own systems. They measured time, yet lost their sense of it. They built vast cities, yet felt lonelier than ever. And yet, in those smoke-filled factories, the great ideas of freedom and equality were forged. As millions were exploited, Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, declaring that history was a struggle between those who owned and those who did not. As machines replaced human hands, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, a prophetic story about humanity creating something beyond its control. As railroads connected the continents, thinkers like Darwin, Mill, and Nietzsche began to ask, what is man in this new universe? Invention, philosophy, and social movements together shook the old foundations. While the steam engine shattered the limits of matter, ideas of liberty, democracy, and human rights shattered the limits of the mind. Europe, and soon North America, awoke in a fever of new energy, the energy of human will. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change the economy, it changed the feeling of reality itself. Once, people lived in wide spaces and slow time. Now they lived in narrow spaces and compressed time. Railroads turned days into hours. The telegraph turned distance into illusion. What we now call globalization began there, when matter, goods, ideas, people, and even conflict began to move faster than the world could comprehend. When the final gears of the Industrial Revolution had turned to their limits, humanity began to look back and to realize that machines of steel were no longer enough. They wanted to understand the structure of reality itself. If steam had given them power, now they wanted to command the very energy of the universe. And so the 20th century opened with two questions humanity had never dared to ask before. What is matter, truly? And
what are we within this vast universe?
from small laboratories across Europe, the first sparks of the atomic age flickered to life. In 1905, Albert Einstein wrote equations that shook the world. Energy and mass were one and the same, E equals mc squared. A tiny bit of matter, if released, could unleash energy equal to that of a star. Those numbers, born as abstract theory, opened the door to both divine power and ultimate destruction. While Einstein sought to understand the cosmos, Marie Curie toiled with radium in a dim Paris lab. Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, and Fermi stepped into the realm of the atom, a place where time, space, and probability blurred together. It was no longer Newton's clockwork universe of certainty, but one of mystery and chance, a world where things did not exist but might exist. The 20th century began as a poem of intellect and quickly became a symphony of fire. In 1939, before humanity could even grasp the meaning of E equals mc squared, it was turned into a weapon. From the Manhattan Project to Hiroshima, what began as a triumph of reason became the shadow of morality. A single atom of uranium split. and in seconds a city turned to ash.
The flame of knowledge, once meant to warm humanity, now burned it.
The world entered the atomic age, an era where every nation held the power to erase life itself. And yet, from that terror came reflection. For the first time, humanity truly understood power does not equal victory, it equals responsibility. As the smoke of Hiroshima faded, a new race began, the race for space. From the ruins of war, people lifted their eyes to the heavens and realized they had reached the edge of their world. In 1957, Sputnik 1 left Earth's atmosphere, sending a simple beep-beep across the void, a declaration that humankind had stepped beyond its home. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth, gazing upon the blue planet and saying, "I see the Earth. It is so beautiful." Only 8 years after that, humanity walked on the moon. When Neil Armstrong set foot upon the grey dust, his words echoed like a prophecy for all mankind. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. From the coal fires of the 19th century to the starlight of the 20th, less than 100 years had passed, a blink in Earth's history. But in that leap, humanity saw what thousands of years of philosophy had only guessed. The universe is vast beyond measure, and we are but dust within it. From space, Earth had no borders, no nations, no colors, only a single blue dot drifting in the dark. Alongside those great voyages came an invisible revolution, the information revolution. The first computers filled entire rooms. Soon they shrank until they fit in the palm of a hand. Humanity learned to store memory not on paper, but in bits and bytes. They built a network that connected the entire planet, and once again, the world shrank, becoming a kind of giant brain for the species itself. Knowledge exploded, but as always, the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. As we learned to split the atom, we also learned how to destroy. As we flew beyond our planet, we discovered how fragile it truly was. In the famous blue marble photograph from Apollo 17, Earth appeared whole, round, beautiful, and alone. No borders, no flags, no battle lines. Only one home. For the first time, humanity didn't just see the world, it saw itself within the world. The atomic and space ages proved that intellect could carry us to the stars, but also reminded us that one mistake could bring us back to ashes. Amid nuclear energy and space travel, supercomputers and genetic maps, the oldest question of all returned. We are intelligent, but are we wise enough to survive our own intelligence? From the moment early humans first struck a spark in a cave to the instant they reached for the stars, every step of evolution has shared one constant, the desire to surpass their own limits. After mastering the atom, conquering space, and bending the laws of physics, there remained only one frontier left unconquered, the limit of life itself. The 21st century did not begin with the sound of gunfire or the flash of nuclear fire, but with the soft beep of a DNA scanner, the flicker of genetic code on a screen, and the quiet hum of algorithms that could learn and dream. For the first time, humanity looked into the mirror and saw its reflection: artificial intelligence. If the Industrial Revolution was the age when humans learned to reshape nature, this is the age when they are learning to recreate it. In sterile laboratories, scientists no longer merely observe life, they rewrite it. From the mapping of the human genome in 2003 to the rise of CRISPR gene editing, DNA is now edited like text. Birth, aging, illness, death, once the fixed rhythm of existence, are now variables in an equation. Genes are spliced, tissues regrown, organs cultivated, and somewhere between science and myth, the dream of creating new forms of life begins to stir. But biology is not the only thing transforming. Intelligence itself is multiplying. As machines learn to learn and AI learns to think, humanity is no longer the only creative species on Earth. Lines of code now write poetry, paint portraits, compose symphonies, build software, and reason at speeds no human brain can match. The machine no longer replaces the hand, it replaces the mind. A question echoes through time like the fire stolen by Prometheus. If we can create intelligence, are we creating a god or merely a reflection of ourselves? From DeepMind mastering the game of Go to ChatGPT composing essays, the world is witnessing a silent handover, a shift where the line between creation and imitation grows thin. What unsettles us is not that machines are becoming human, but that humans are beginning to act like machines. Brains are scanned by MRI, emotions translated into electrical signals, memories uploaded to servers. The border between natural and artificial is fading. If life can be copied and consciousness can be programmed, then what truly makes us human? Science offers no answer, only a mirror, cold and precise. Philosophy, which once asked, "What is the soul?" must now learn to redefine, "What is the body?" The world is entering a post-human age, where biology, technology, and consciousness merge. The body becomes something to upgrade, the mind something to back up, life itself a stream of data. Some call it salvation through technology.
Others call it the dissolution of humanity.
But perhaps amid the circuits and neural networks there remains one thing that cannot be replicated: meaning. Even when we can reprogram life, we still search for reasons to live. We want to know why we create, why we love, why we suffer, why we still cry at a piece of music.
Perhaps that the ability to feel what cannot be measured is our final frontier.
Not intelligence, but the awareness of our own fragility. And maybe after millions of years of evolution, as humanity sees its reflection in the machine, the question is no longer what can we create, but rather if we can make everything, even intelligence, emotion, and life itself, what then still makes us human? When humanity first began to ask what it truly meant to be human, we looked outward and were met with a silence so vast that even the question itself seemed to dissolve into it. The first ships that escaped Earth's atmosphere carried not only metal and fuel, but the pride of an entire species. And in that instant, Earth appeared small, a lonely blue jewel adrift in the endless dark. From space, all borders vanished. No nations, no religions, no battle lines, only one planet, round, bright, and fragile, floating in the eternal night. And when the first radio signals were sent into that darkness, humankind waited for an answer. But more than 70 years have passed and the reply has never come. No voices, no intelligent light, flickering among the hundreds of billions of galaxies. Only silence, not the silence of peace but of distance, deep, long, infinite. And within that silence, the oldest question of all knowledge returned. Are we truly alone? According to science, the universe has existed for roughly 13.8 billion years. The Earth, just over 4 billion. Humanity, barely a breath at the end of that cosmic day. If the entire history of the universe were a single 24-hour day, all of human civilization would occupy the final second before midnight. So what filled the other 23 hours and 59 minutes? Has someone, or something, walked this sky before us and vanished before we ever looked up? The odds suggest life cannot be unique to us. Among the trillions of planets, if only a fraction hold water, air, and carbon, then millions of Earth-like worlds should exist. Astronomers call them exoplanets, worlds that orbit other suns, sitting in the habitable zone where light is gentle enough for life to bloom. But if life is so common, why haven't we found it? That is the Fermi paradox, the paradox of silence. Perhaps they never existed, or perhaps they did long ago and are now gone. One cold theory says that every civilization, upon reaching a certain threshold of power, destroys itself. When they learn to harness the energy of stars, they also invent the tools of their own extinction. When they master genes, matter, and intelligence, they surpass what nature can bear and collapse under the weight of their own ambition. If that's true, then the silence of the cosmos isn't empty, it's haunted. The stars we see may once have had cities, music, and philosophy, now reduced to dust orbiting black holes. Maybe life is common, but enduring intelligence is unimaginably rare. Every civilization a brief flame in the night, burning bright, then fading, leaving darkness for the next flame to rise. Perhaps we are simply one more spark in that endless cycle. But there's another idea, softer, more haunting. Perhaps they're still there, quietly watching. Like adults observing a child learning to speak, they watch us stumble through the dawn of our awareness. They don't intervene, nor do they answer, because every civilization must pass the test of consciousness. Maybe they once were like us. And maybe when we grow wiser, when we learn humility and learn to listen, the universe will finally respond.
The WOW signal of 1977, strange radio waves from Hercules, the mysterious flickering of Tabby's star, all these feel like gentle knocks on the door of our solitude, whispering, "Has someone been here?" Or worse, was it once us and we've forgotten?
For when we gaze into the stars, it's hard not to wonder whether civilization is a straight line or a circle. Maybe, millions of years ago, another intelligence walked this very planet. Not human, but something else, erased by time, geology, and the sea. Perhaps we are merely the memory of that ancient mind, rewritten in new form. The planet remembering itself. If so, we are not the first, only the next. Science calls it the Great Filter, the invisible barrier between primitive life and enduring intelligence. Maybe humanity is standing right in the middle of it. Maybe in a few centuries we'll know whether we've passed through it or perished like the flames before us. The farther we travel into the universe, the lonelier we feel. But that loneliness makes the question, is anyone out there, not just a mystery, but a prayer shared by all humankind? Because if someone is out there, they must be staring at their own sky, wondering the same thing. And if we truly are alone, then we are the universe's only voice, the storyteller of existence itself. That responsibility is not a burden, but an inheritance. For if there's no one else to remember, then it is we who must keep the flame alive, to tell the story of earth, of wind, of oceans, of all who came and went.
Perhaps the universe is still waiting for us to learn how to answer. Not with signals, but with the way we live. Maybe we're not alone. Perhaps the cosmos is simply too vast, and the oldest souls have learned the beauty of silence.
Because within that silence lies a quiet faith that while every civilization is temporary, the meaning of life itself is eternal.